What's one moment that made you go, that's it, I'm done?
When my mother stood up at her 60th birthday party, held her wine glass with that smug little smile she saves for public performances, and said, "Vanessa will be taking over the family legacy," I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't argue or make a scene like she probably expected I would. No, I just raised my glass, smiled, and said, "She can have the will. I already bought the land this restaurant sits on." And in that exact second, for the first time in my life, I watched my mother shut up. Completely. You could have heard a damn olive drop in that room. Vanessa's perfect little Botox smile twitched, and my father, God bless him, blinked like he'd just come out of a coma. That moment wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't even petty. It was the final move in a game I've been playing silently for 20 years. To understand what led to that moment, you need to know one simple truth. My sister Vanessa has always been the golden child. She could burn the house down and Mom would ask why I didn't stop her. She could lie, cheat, steal, hell. One time in high school she got caught with stolen makeup in her purse, and my mother blamed the cashier for being jealous of how pretty Vanessa was. Meanwhile, I got grounded for getting a B in calculus. That was the rhythm of our childhood. Vanessa shines, and I mop up the mess behind her. Growing up in our family restaurant, La Terra, wasn't glamorous, despite what my mother's Pinterest-worthy social posts might suggest now. I scrubbed dishes in the back every night after school while Vanessa was whisked away to voice lessons, pageants, or some other talent polishing activity meant to keep her brilliance polished and on display. I still remember being 12 years old, wrist deep in gray dishwater, while my mom was out front telling a customer, "Vanessa's going to be something big. She has that star quality, you know." Never mind that I was the one helping Dad manage inventory when he threw his back out or learning how to balance the books when the accountant ghosted us. But that's the thing about being the invisible one, you learn to see everything. In high school, the favoritism got worse. I got a part-time job at the bookstore to save for college, and my mom accused me of abandoning the family. Vanessa wrecked her car twice and still got a new one for her birthday, wrapped in a bow, no less. I got a used laptop with a cracked screen and a lecture about how good I had it. There wasn't a holiday, graduation, or family gathering where Vanessa wasn't placed at the center of the table like a damn Christmas turkey, while I hovered in the background making sure the gravy didn't burn. When I got into college on scholarship, mind you, my mom's response wasn't pride. It was, "But what about the restaurant? You think you're better than where you came from?" And I'll admit it, for a while I started to believe her. I started thinking maybe I was the problem. Maybe if I just kept my head down, worked harder, stayed quieter, I'd earn her love the way Vanessa seemed to receive it just for existing. But somewhere between my second and third year of college, that thinking died. It was a slow death, the kind that comes after enough ignored birthdays and passive-aggressive digs. Vanessa called me one night, drunk in some rooftop bar in Miami, and said, "I don't know how you do it, Mel. You're like, dependable." It's cute. That word, cute, hit me like a shovel. I realized then I was never going to be seen as anything more than background noise in my own family. I was the girl who kept the plates spinning while the golden child basked in the spotlight. So I stopped trying to be visible. I stopped explaining myself. I came back home after college not because I gave up, but because I had a plan. I got certified in bookkeeping, worked days at a local firm, and nights in the restaurant. I watched. I listened. I kept track of every decision my mother made that could be considered risky, illegal, or downright foolish. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew deep down that someday I'd need leverage. Someday, they'd come for me again, and this time, I wasn't going to just take it. It didn't take long. Vanessa, of course, flamed out of her yoga teacher phase in less than 2 years. She opened a boutique yoga studio uptown with a loan co-signed by, you guessed it, our mother. No business plan, no financial cushion, just an idea and a lot of buzzwords like manifestation and spiritual alignment. She burned through money like it was confetti, and when the studio inevitably tanked, I found out the hard way that our family restaurant had been used as collateral. My father had no clue. The man had been signing what my mother put in front of him for 30 years. I was furious, but not surprised. That's the thing about being around narcissists long enough. You stop being shocked. You just start documenting. I confronted my mother, not in public, not dramatically, but in the back office with the sticky door and the flickering fluorescent light. She didn't deny it. She didn't even apologize. She just shrugged and said, "Vanessa needed a start. You're so good with numbers, I figured you'd figure it out." Like I was some kind of human safety net. And this is where I want to ask the people watching this. Have you ever had that moment when you realized your family doesn't actually see you, just what you can do for them? Have you ever cleaned up someone else's mess so many times that they forgot it wasn't your job? Because that was the moment I stopped feeling like a daughter and started feeling like an unpaid intern in someone else's fantasy. From that day on, I made a choice. I was done reacting. Done explaining. Done trying to be seen. I was going to get smart, get quiet, and get everything I needed to be free. Not just legally free, but emotionally unhooked from their chaos. And it all started with a conversation I had with a real estate attorney over coffee one morning, who said something I'll never forget. Ownership isn't about your name on a sign. It's about who holds the dirt. And in that moment, the seed was planted. Not a seed of revenge, exactly, but a seed of something deeper, something that tasted a lot like justice. The kind of justice that takes time, patience, and an iron stomach to pull off. The kind of justice no one ever saw coming, especially not Vanessa. I wish I could say I stormed out of that office the day I found out about the loan, slammed the door behind me, told my mother exactly what I thought of her manipulations, her lies, her lifelong obsession with propping Vanessa up like some crooked trophy on a shelf made of denial, but I didn't. I just stood there, quiet, listening to her justify selling off the future of the restaurant, the same one she claimed was our family legacy, like it was a vase at a garage sale, and I realized something bone deep and bitter. My mother had never seen the business as something to be passed down to the one who built it. She saw it as a gift she could bestow to the daughter she actually liked. The restaurant, like everything else in her world, was just a stage where Vanessa got to shine and I got to sweep up the broken spotlight bulbs after her solo. I didn't argue because arguing with my mother is like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. Whatever you say, she bends it, twists it, melts it, and somehow you end up apologizing for making her feel bad. She has this incredible ability to spin the truth just enough that everyone else in the room starts to doubt their memory of events, even when the evidence is right in front of them. My dad was a ghost in this entire mess, a man who used to have opinions and boundaries, now reduced to a soft-spoken shell who quietly nodded at whatever kept the kitchen running and the yelling to a minimum. He sat in the corner during our conversation, rubbing his temples like my mother's decisions gave him migraines, but never enough anger to stop her, and when I looked at him for backup, all he said was, "You know how she is." Yes, I did. That was the problem. I left the office that day without raising my voice, without pointing fingers, without demanding justice, because I had already learned something far more useful than outrage. People like my mother and my sister expect noise. They feed off of it. They prepare for it. They defend against it. But they never prepare for silence. Silence is unsettling. Silence is a warning shot they can't track. So I gave them exactly what they weren't expecting. I said nothing. I just walked out, got into my beat-up Honda with the cracked dashboard and the radio that only played country stations, and started planning. That night, in my tiny apartment with the peeling linoleum and the smell of burnt coffee in the air, I started digging through every legal document I could get my hands on: leases, purchase agreements, zoning permits, anything that would tell me who actually owned the land under La Terra. And that's when I found it. The land wasn't ours. It never had been. The restaurant had been leased for decades, first by my grandfather, then renewed quietly by my father without any changes to ownership, and the current owner was an 82-year-old man named Frank Russo, who lived less than 15 minutes away and had been trying to get someone to buy him out for over a year. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, not because I'd stumbled onto some legal loophole, but because it confirmed something I'd only suspected. My mother had built her empire on sand, and she didn't even know it. She thought she owned the world she ruled, but she didn't even own the ground under her own damn throne. It was poetic in a way that made my teeth hurt from clenching my jaw too tight. Over the next few weeks, I started spending my evenings with Frank, first under the pretense of helping him digitize his rental records, then later just sitting with him in his backyard while he told me stories about my grandfather and the early days of the restaurant. Frank was the kind of man who appreciated loyalty, consistency, and a good cup of black coffee. He told me about how he'd tried to sell the land twice, but both times the buyers pulled out because of zoning complications and tenant agreements, and how he just didn't have the energy to deal with it anymore. That's when I made my offer, not flashy, not greedy, just fair and clean and quiet. I didn't put the land in my name directly, of course. That would have been too obvious, too risky, too early. I used a limited liability company I set up through a lawyer I'd met while doing books for a small architecture firm in town, a guy who owed me a favor and didn't ask too many questions. Within 6 weeks, I owned the land under La Terra, and not a single soul in my family had a clue. Not Vanessa, not my mother, not even my father, who continued to shuffle papers and take orders like everything was fine. Meanwhile, Vanessa's yoga disaster faded into the background as quickly as it had flared up. She posted one final Instagram story about transitioning to a more spiritual chapter and then quietly moved back in with our parents, which my mother spun as Vanessa helping us at the restaurant full-time. What that really meant was Vanessa floated around the front of house like a queen on a lazy throne, pretending to manage things while the actual work landed, as always, on my shoulders. Customers smiled and said how nice it was to see both daughters working together, and I smiled back while quietly transferring invoices to my private spreadsheet, noting every shortfall, every misstep. Every time Vanessa comped a bottle of wine for her friends without checking stock levels. I was building something far bigger than they knew. Not just legal ownership, not just leverage, but evidence. Patterns. Data. I was learning their weaknesses from the inside, not to destroy them in a dramatic firestorm, but to suffocate them in slow precision. My revenge wasn't going to come in a blaze of glory. It was going to come in quiet signatures and closing notices. And they were going to thank me for it until the very last second. But before any of that could happen, the universe handed me something I didn't even realize I was waiting for. A man in a navy blazer walked into the restaurant one afternoon, sat down at the bar, ordered a Negroni, and asked to speak to the owner. My mother, of course, rushed to the front, dripping in fake pearls and entitlement, and the man introduced himself as a representative for a development firm that was very interested in acquiring properties in the neighborhood. My mother laughed him off like he was just another vulture, but I saw it immediately, the twitch in Vanessa's eyebrow, the quick glance she gave the man, the wheels turning behind her perfectly manicured forehead. She wasn't going to let this go. That's when I knew. Vanessa was going to try to sell the restaurant out from under us to save face, to finally prove she was a real businesswoman, to secure whatever legacy my mother had promised her behind closed doors. And that was fine by me. Let them plan. Let them dream. Let them think they still held the power. Because every time they made a move, they walked right into a game I'd already won. There's a kind of power in pretending you don't know what someone is planning against you, a quiet, simmering control that hums underneath the surface of every conversation, every sideways glance, every falsely sweet compliment dripping with ulterior motives. And if you can keep your mouth shut long enough, if you can let them believe you're still the same version of yourself they've always underestimated, then when the moment comes to flip the entire game board over, you can do it without ever raising your voice, without ever breaking a sweat, and they won't even realize they've lost until their fingers are already gripping the empty air where their throne used to be. From the moment that development guy walked through the door, with his business cards and vague mentions of expansion potential, I knew Vanessa's next act was already being written, and I didn't need a script to know my role. I would play the loyal, dependable daughter, the background player, the silent operator who kept the place running while the golden child made promises she couldn't keep to men she didn't understand, and all the while I'd be one step ahead, listening in shadows, writing my own ending in legal contracts and private conversations no one in my family would ever be invited to. Vanessa's performance shifted subtly, like watching a new scene unfold with the same lead actress, only this time her lines were practiced, sharper, like she had rehearsed them in front of a mirror each night before bed. She started bringing her laptop to the restaurant, setting up at the front counter like some overpaid consultant, pretending to take meetings, clicking her tongue at inventory sheets she didn't understand, and spouting buzzwords like brand refresh and profit visibility to anyone within earshot. My mother, of course, swooned. She called it natural leadership and told anyone who asked that Vanessa was taking the reins as part of their succession plan, which was code for, "We're going to screw Melissa over quietly and then act surprised when she gets upset." But I didn't get upset. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, smiled, and kept doing the books every night after closing, making sure every receipt was logged, every invoice matched, every penny tracked, not just because I cared about the numbers, but because I knew the time would come when proof would speak louder than loyalty, and I wasn't going to rely on memory or principle when I could rely on cold, hard documentation. One night, after closing, I stayed later than usual. Everyone else had gone home, even my father, who shuffled out mumbling about an old Clint Eastwood movie he wanted to catch before falling asleep in his recliner. I stood alone in the back office, the overhead light buzzing faintly above me, and opened the locked drawer of the steel filing cabinet nobody touched anymore because everyone thought paper records were obsolete. Inside, I slipped in a sealed envelope, carefully labeled in my handwriting, and pushed it beneath a stack of outdated tax returns. An envelope that contained a notarized letter naming me as the sole managing partner of the LLC that owned the land beneath La Terra, along with a dated purchase agreement, proof of funds, and correspondence from Frank Russo himself. If things went sideways, if Vanessa or my mother somehow caught wind of what I had done and tried to retaliate, that envelope would be my shield, and I knew exactly who I'd have delivered it if the time ever came. Meanwhile, the development firm started sending more men, first one, then two, then eventually a woman in a navy skirt suit with a portfolio full of renderings showing what La Terra Plaza might look like if the property were ever reimagined into something sleek and profitable. Vanessa practically drooled over the sketches, glass walls, marble counters, rooftop dining, but she was careful not to show it in front of my mother, who still clung to the romantic illusion of keeping it in the family. Even though she had quietly given Vanessa power of attorney for the business side of things just weeks earlier, a detail I only discovered because my father, in his absent-minded honesty, left the paperwork on the passenger seat of his truck, assuming I already knew. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, made a mental note, and called my lawyer that afternoon to double-check the eviction clause in the lease I now controlled. 90 days. That's all I needed. 90 days notice, and they'd be legally required to vacate the building unless they negotiated a new lease with me, the actual owner, which I could, of course, decline without explanation. But I didn't want them out. Not yet. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them confident. I wanted Vanessa to keep calling herself owner in public, to keep tagging herself in photos at her family restaurant, to keep leaning in closer to that deal with the developers she clearly thought would turn her into the kind of businesswoman she'd been pretending to be for the last 10 years. Because I had no intention of selling, not to them, not to anyone. My investment wasn't for profit. It was for control. The best revenge isn't profit. It isn't public humiliation. It's knowing that the people who tried to cut you out now have to ask your permission to take a breath in the space they thought they ruled. One night, as I was locking up, I found Vanessa standing outside the front door, arms crossed, face flushed with the kind of nervous energy that usually meant something stupid was about to be said. She asked me to talk, which, in Vanessa language, meant she had rehearsed a monologue and just needed me to stand there like a mirror while she delivered it. She launched into some speech about how mom's getting older and we need to start thinking long-term, and how we could leverage the restaurant's reputation for a better future. She even used the word partnership, like we were equals. Like we'd been walking the same path when I'd been paving the damn thing under her heels for 2 decades. I nodded through the whole thing. Didn't interrupt once. When she finished, I looked her in the eyes and asked, What happens if the landowner doesn't want to sell? She blinked, confused for a second, then said something about incentives and negotiation. I smiled again. God, I must have looked like a lunatic, and said, well, I guess we'll just have to see what he wants. Then I walked away. Back in my apartment, I sat in the dark for a long time, the city noise humming through the cracked window, and I thought about how long I'd waited for this moment. Not just the opportunity for revenge, but the moment when Vanessa would look at me and see a question mark where she used to see a doormat. She didn't know yet, but the game was already over. She was just playing out the final moves. It was the kind of evening that felt manufactured, like someone had opened a catalog titled Luxury without substance and ordered one of everything: crystal goblets no one would remember drinking from, floral arrangements taller than the actual guests, and a rented saxophone player who stood in the corner near the cake table playing vaguely familiar jazz standards like he was counting seconds until his contract ended, and all of it was packed into the dining hall of La Terra, transformed for one night into a shrine to my mother's ego, under the guise of celebrating her 60th birthday, though anyone with eyes could tell this was more coronation than party, more a passing of the crown to Vanessa than any genuine gathering of family or community. The restaurant smelled like too many competing perfumes and melting fondant, and everywhere I looked, there were people nodding along to conversations they didn't care about, laughing politely at stories they'd already heard a dozen times, and watching Vanessa glide through the crowd like a debutante on her second glass of expensive wine, her white silk dress clinging just right, her fake modesty in full performance mode, offering air kisses and empty compliments like a politician working the room before Election Day. And through it all, my mother beamed. She clutched Vanessa's hand like they were co-hosting a talk show, smiling in that tight, controlled way she does when she's already decided how the evening will end, and anyone who deviates from the script will be treated as an inconvenience or a villain. I kept my position near the back, close enough to the bar to grab a drink if I needed an excuse to step away, far enough from the action to avoid being pulled into any of the swirling whirlpools of fake nostalgia and polished lies. I watched as my father floated through the room like a misplaced ghost, smiling vaguely at people who thought they knew him, shaking hands he didn't really remember, offering the occasional awkward laugh, though his eyes betrayed nothing but fatigue, like his soul had long since filed for early retirement. When the string lights dimmed and the makeshift stage was lit with an obnoxiously warm spotlight, I knew it was time. My mother stepped up to the microphone with the grace of someone who had practiced this moment in her head for months, maybe years. The woman who used to yell at me for breathing too loudly now stood poised and glowing, her speech already written behind her eyelids. She cleared her throat delicately and tapped her glass, and the room quieted like someone had cut the power. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice syrupy and rehearsed. "Tonight isn't just about celebrating another year of life. It's about legacy, about what we build, what we leave behind, and who we entrust with carrying our dreams into the future." At that point, I swear the room collectively exhaled in anticipation, like they all knew this wasn't just going to be a speech, but a performance, a climax, and Vanessa stepped a little closer to the stage, eyes wide, lips parted, not with surprise, but with the confidence of someone who had already been told this would be her night. My mother went on about the sacrifices they'd made, about how hard it had been starting the restaurant, about the vision she and my father had shared. Even though everyone in the room knew it was mostly her show, her name people associated with La Terra, her image in the Yelp photos, her quotes in the local paper, her brand built atop decades of controlling every detail down to the fold of the napkins. "And so," she said, smiling broadly now as we look ahead to the future of La Terra, "it brings me tremendous joy to formally announce that Vanessa will be taking over everything. She'll be the face, the decision-maker, the one to lead us forward." The applause started slowly, unsurely, like a few guests weren't quite sure what had just happened, but then Vanessa stepped forward with a gracious nod and that fake humility that's almost more offensive than arrogance, and the clapping picked up speed, punctuated by a few cheers from the younger cousins who didn't know any better. I stayed where I was, arms crossed, face neutral, watching it unfold like a documentary I'd already seen, one where you know the villain wins in the middle but gets blindsided before the credits roll. My mother looked around the room like a queen surveying her court, her expression glowing with the satisfaction of a plan finally fulfilled. And then she made her mistake. She raised her glass and said, with far too much pleasure, to the future of La Terra, under Vanessa's leadership. That was my cue. I took a step forward, not dramatically, not with a stomp or a shout, but with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer had anything to prove, and raised my own glass, my voice calm but clear enough to cut through the noise. She can have the will, I said, locking eyes with my mother, and then Vanessa, who froze mid-smile. I already bought the land this restaurant sits on. There was a pause, a gap in time where sound stopped existing, where breath caught in chests, where eyes blinked and mouths half opened, but no words came out, like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire evening. My mother's hand tightened around her glass, knuckles pale, and for the first time in maybe my entire life, I saw something new in her expression: panic. Not just shock, not just anger, but pure, unfiltered panic. Vanessa's smile cracked so slightly you'd miss it if you didn't know her, but I did. I knew every twitch in her face, every flicker of confusion she tried to mask with charm, and I watched it all unravel in real time. My father looked at me then, really looked, like he was seeing me for the first time since I was 12 years old, wiping down counters and dreaming of escape. He didn't say a word, but his face said enough. It was pride, regret, maybe relief. I sipped my drink, let the silence stretch another moment, then set my glass down and walked toward the exit. I didn't wait for questions. I didn't offer explanations. I didn't owe them a damn thing. Outside, the night was cooler than expected, the air thick with the smell of summer grass and spent fireworks, though there were none, only the quiet victory of truth revealed too late for damage control. As I stepped off the curb and into my car, I could still hear the stunned quiet from inside the restaurant, the echo of my words lingering in the place they once called theirs. Let them keep the lights. Let them keep the name. Let them keep their speeches and their applause and their illusion of power. I held the dirt. And that was enough. In the days that followed the party, if you can still call it a party after what happened, though I'd be more inclined to label it an unveiling, or maybe a controlled demolition. The atmosphere around the restaurant changed in a way that wasn't immediately visible to the naked eye, but could be felt in the silence between conversations, in the way people stopped laughing when I walked into a room, in the growing awareness that the balance of power had shifted so drastically and so irrevocably that no one quite knew how to behave anymore. The once carefully staged charade, choreographed so obsessively by my mother and enthusiastically performed by Vanessa, began to unravel thread by thread, not in a dramatic collapse, but in the quiet way all illusions die, first with denial, then with panic, and finally with resignation. It didn't take long for word to get around. Staff who had always looked to Vanessa for directions suddenly started hesitating before asking her anything of consequence, waiting instead for my response, or better yet, avoiding both of us entirely. As though any decision made in that building might suddenly trigger another revelation they hadn't been warned about. My mother, true to form, tried to act as if nothing had changed, smiling a little too wide, organizing wine tastings and posting filtered photos of Vanessa leading the team like a desperate PR campaign, but her voice lost its sharpness. And there was a tightness in her movements, a subtle tension that betrayed just how hard she was working to maintain the fantasy now that the foundation had been ripped out from underneath her. Vanessa, for her part, took a few days to regroup before launching into what I can only assume was her emergency recovery plan. She started making calls, holding impromptu meetings in the back room, whispering urgently to the same development firm that had once shown up with sketches of rooftop terraces and boutique signage. But what she didn't realize, what she couldn't realize, despite her lifelong training in manipulation, was that the game she thought she was playing was already over. I hadn't just outmaneuvered her publicly, I had legally, structurally, and irrevocably removed the very ground she stood on, and every conversation she had, every offer she considered, every half-formed strategy she scribbled in her notebook was useless unless I agreed to it. And I wasn't agreeing to anything. Not out of spite, not even out of revenge, but because, for the first time in my life, I didn't need to. There was nothing left for me to prove, no affection to win back, no apologies I still wanted to hear. I had played their game on their terms for far too long, sacrificing years of my life trying to be the reliable one, the reasonable one, the one who never made a scene, and in the end, it wasn't rage or rebellion that got me the victory they never saw coming. It was patience. I had learned how to outwait them. And that, it turned out, was far more lethal than any confrontation ever could have been. My mother attempted one last maneuver, of course, she always does. She asked me to meet her at the restaurant after closing one evening, just the two of us, no pretense, no audience, just a civil conversation between mother and daughter, though the phrase itself already stank of manipulation. I showed up, not because I thought she'd say anything I hadn't already heard, but because I wanted to look her in the eye one last time and make sure she understood, really understood, that the version of me she had built her power upon no longer existed. She sat at the same table where she used to fold napkins during rush hour, the same table where I had once asked if I could design a new menu layout, and she'd laughed, saying, "Stick to numbers, Melissa, you're not creative," and now she looked older than I remembered. Her makeup unable to hide the exhaustion, her posture less regal, more brittle, like the weight of everything she had pretended to carry with pride had finally caught up to her spine. "I don't think you understand what you've done," she said, skipping the pleasantries altogether, going straight for the condescension she wore like perfume. "I understand exactly what I've done," I replied, keeping my voice even, my expression unreadable. "I protected what you were willing to lose." She leaned forward, hands clasped, trying to evoke the maternal softness she thought she could weaponize. "This isn't what your father would have wanted." And that, finally, made me laugh, not cruelly, not loudly, but the kind of low, tired laugh that escapes when someone insults your intelligence so profoundly it no longer even hurts. "My father didn't want anything," I said. "He gave up wanting things a long time ago. You saw to that." The silence between us was heavy, not with emotion, but with finality. There was nothing left to argue about, no truths left to twist, no guilt left to extract. She stared at me, realizing too late that the daughter she thought she could always bend had finally, irrevocably, broken free. The next day, I handed her an official letter of non-renewal, legally ending the lease at the close of the quarter. She had 90 days to vacate the building, and if she wanted to negotiate new terms, she could do so as a tenant, no longer an owner, no longer a queen, just another name on a contract she didn't draft. Vanessa confronted me 2 days later in the parking lot, voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and disbelief, her perfectly curated confidence cracking under the pressure of reality. She called me cold, selfish, paranoid. She accused me of betraying the family, of killing our legacy, of ruining everything we'd built. "No," I said, calmly, as I unlocked my car. "I saved it from the two of you." And then, because I couldn't help myself, I offered her a job as a hostess. Minimum wage, part-time, evenings only. She didn't respond. She just stared, like someone watching a building collapse from the inside. Weeks passed, and the restaurant continued to operate, quieter now, simpler. I hired new staff. I updated the menu. I brought back some of the old recipes my grandfather used to make before my mother turned the place into a monument to her control. People noticed the difference. The food tasted like it used to, like home. The atmosphere lost its tension. And somewhere in that quiet, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years: peace. One night, long after closing, I walked into the back office, the one with the flickering light and the drawer I had once filled with insurance policies and hidden truths. I opened it slowly, pulled out the envelope I had labeled to be opened only if I lose everything, and stared at it in silence. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I slid it back into the drawer and closed it with a soft click. Because I hadn't lost anything. I had just finally stopped waiting for someone else to give me permission to win.